Amen. We'll be looking at that passage that Christian just read recently, Daniel chapter 1. And when you think about going through this chapter, in some ways you may think, well, how can something 2,500 years ago have any relevance to me today? But in a sense, even as the song that we sang twice, maybe there was a reason for us to sing it twice. Because there is an element, although that was not written in line necessarily with Daniel, it was written kind of with the words from the book of Job, recognizing Job lost so much. And yet in the midst of it all, he continued to praise God's name. And in a sense, when we come to Daniel, he has everything taken from him. In fact, actually, he was taken from everything. And yet, he was not shaken. And that's what we'll be looking at this morning. Daniel, taken, but not shaken. And the reality is, every single one of us go through different trials and different struggles. Now, what would you do if your city was invaded, your home destroyed, your future taken, and you were forced into a culture that stood against everything you believed? Now, the reality is, probably for most every one of us, that will never happen to us. But every single one of us face different circumstances, different challenges, different trials, different decisions that stand before us, and we have to wonder and we have to decide which direction, which way will I choose? You know, as we continue, as we think about Daniel, have you ever felt like because of what's been done to you, it gives you an excuse or allows you to justify what comes from you? This has happened to me, which is an excuse. And I understand it has an impact in our lives, but sometimes we allow it to become an excuse, or we justify what we do because what has happened to me gives me a reason for what comes out of me. And also, in the midst of life, how do you stay faithful when life is not fair? If you have children, have you ever heard the phrase, "It's not fair"? Have you ever given the response, "Life isn't fair"? Because even if I make what is fair in your eyes, all of a sudden it becomes unfair in the other child's eye. Now, as we look at Daniel's life, when you consider the greatest test in his entire life, what would you say? Many people, well, the idea, the story that comes to people's minds the most when it comes to Daniel's life is Daniel and the fill in the blank, lion's den. And that comes to people's minds the most when they think about Daniel. And they may think the biggest decision he ever had to make was facing the lion's den. But the reality, and I think the reason why Daniel recorded this passage was because he recognized the biggest decision he ever made, the decision that had the biggest impact in his life, was not at the lion's den, but it was actually at the dinner table. Something that we would think as very irrelevant, doesn't have much impact, but actually this is where Daniel begins his story because he recognized the importance of how it impacted the rest of his life. Now, as we read through that first section, the first two verses, it mentions about Nebuchadnezzar. He comes, he surrounds Jerusalem. He had already conquered Egypt. He had already conquered the Assyrians. He had already become a world-dominating empire. So when he surrounds Jerusalem, there wasn't really much of a battle. Jerusalem quickly surrenders to Nebuchadnezzar. And in the meantime, Nebuchadnezzar, he takes the sacred vessels from the temple. And in a sense, what he would do when he would take over a nation, it wasn't just about acquiring land. But by taking the sacred vessels and bringing them back and putting them in his house of God's, it was in a sense saying there was a spiritual domination over the world. Not only that, but in verse 3 and 4, not only did he take the vessels, but he also took the young men. The best, the brightest, the smartest, the best looking. I mean, the ones that you would have the top notch for any dating app, right? These were most likely probably 12 to 14, 12 to 16 years old. Young men, impressionable, and they would put them through a 3-year education. It was the top-notch education. Babylon, they would teach them literature, teach them the new language, teach them, and it wasn't just bringing them back into Babylon to make them as slaves. They were trying to shape them to become workers within the king's courts. Top-notch. We'll read through verse 3 through verse 7. It says, "Then the king instructed Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, to bring some of the children of Israel and some of the king's descendants and some of the nobles, young men in whom there was no blemish, but good-looking, gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge and quick to understand, who had ability to serve in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the language and literature of the Chaldeans. And the king appointed them a daily provision of the king's delicacies and of the wine which he drank, and 3 years of training for them, so that at the end of that time they might serve before the king. Now from among those of whom the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. To them the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. He gave Daniel the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah Shadrach, to Mishael Meshach, and to Azariah Abednego." When you read through all of this, he has taken each one of these young men. He's trying to shape their identity, changing their names. Daniel means God is my judge. And so he takes that, removes that name from Daniel, although throughout the remainder of the book, Daniel continues to refer himself as Daniel, not Belteshazzar. Whereas the other three, we don't often call them Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. We call them Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But in the midst of all of this, you're taken from your land, taken from your parents, to a completely foreign country. Your parents aren't around, the priest is not around, and then on top of all of that, every bad thing that has happened to you, there set in front of you is the best food the world can offer. Every bad thing that has happened, and this is probably the first good thing that has happened to you, what would you do? Well, what would you do if it went against your conscience about what was placed before you? In verse 8, it says, "But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with a portion of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself." To Daniel, the food that was set before him, he recognized, this is not right. This food will defile me. Now, we don't know necessarily what was it that caused him to say no. Now, there's different reasons, different things that people could say. They might think that, well, it wasn't done kosher. Maybe the meat wasn't, well, according to the Levitical law. It wasn't cooked properly. It wasn't fed properly. Maybe it was pork. Or maybe it was cooked with pork. Whatever it was. It could have been that. There's another reason that people could say that the food that was presented and the wine that was presented would have been offered to the gods. And by eating it, would have been recognizing and giving allegiance to the gods rather than the one true and living God. That every good thing that comes from him is a result of the food that he has eaten, and the credit would be given to the gods. We don't know necessarily what it was about, but one of the things it doesn't mention that he did not do it because it would defile his body. It says he did not do it because it would defile himself. It went beyond just about food entering into his body. He recognized it was a bigger picture. He recognized that serving God was not just about a body, but it was with the spirit, soul, and body. It was every part of him. And by eating this, he recognized it would be corrupting him. It would be tarnishing him. It would be doing something against his loyalty to God. Now, for us, it might not be about eating certain foods. But the question we have to ask ourselves is, what is it that I face in my life that my conscience knows what I ought to do? And whatever that decision is, it puts at stake my loyalty to God. Who will I follow? Who will I serve? Who will I put my dependence on? Which direction will I go? And again, Mom and Dad weren't there. He's a young teenager. Now, what would you have done if you were 12 to 16 years old? Would we have the character to do what Daniel did? Well, we're not. But the real question is, what about now? What about today? Mom and Dad wasn't there. The priest wasn't there. He's in a completely different world. Everybody else is doing it. And God's not striking lightning down on them. And all of these thoughts could have gone through his mind. And the question we must ask is, would we stay loyal? And in another sense, why would we risk it all? And the reason that why we do what we do has a massive impact on what we will do. When we think about Daniel, he's placed with this decision. There is a visible king that is given this command. There's an invisible God that is also given a command. Which one would you choose to follow? The one you can see or the one you can't see? The visible king, he's already seen what the destruction he's done. He's already seen the power that he's displayed. He already sees the wrath and what he could do. The invisible king, well, he's quite patient and loving, isn't he? And there's an element when we make our decision, we make it based on who is going to be more merciful. Right? And we know that God is an absolute merciful God. My friends are not merciful. My boss is not merciful. My surroundings, my family, whatever it might be, they are not merciful. And God is merciful. So I am going to base my decision on who is the most merciful and who is going to grant me mercy based on whatever decision I make. That was not how Daniel made his choice. What he based his decision on is who is greater and who is more deserving. Who is greater and who is more deserving? To have me show my allegiance and my obedience. God or Nebuchadnezzar? And there is a different mindset basing our decision on who is more merciful rather than who is more deserving. But Daniel, he recognized God is more deserving of my allegiance and my obedience. And it does not matter what the king says or does. But another part in this passage, when we read that very first part in verse 8, but Daniel purposed in his heart. Daniel resolved in his heart. What that means is Daniel pre-decided before he was ever placed in the circumstances. If you wait until the pressure mounts up to make a decision, if you wait until you are tired to make a decision, if you wait until whatever the circumstances might be to make the decision, what happens? We normally go, what is the most convenient at the time? And there is an element, I was reading a book recently, Think Ahead, and basically speaking about our willpower. You know, we only have so much willpower to spend throughout a day. And it's basically like a muscle. And when you get to the end of the day and you are tired, your willpower is weak. And it's difficult to make the right decision. Have you ever found that? If you schedule things out for the evening and it's already pre-booked, you find you can do certain things. But if you don't have anything scheduled and you don't have any plans for the evening and you're tired, what do you end up doing? The easiest thing, right? Might be flipping on the TV, whatever it might be. But if you already have something pre-booked, and that is the difference of pre-deciding versus making the decision in the moment. If you wait until the moment, you will base your decision on your feelings or what's convenient or the circumstances or whatever it might be. But when you pre-decide, this is what I'm going to do. I don't know what the cost is going to be. I don't know what the decision, the outcome. I don't know any of that. I'm going to pre-decide. Daniel, before, when he was still in Jerusalem, he had already purposed in his heart he would not defile himself. He was God's, no matter what. And so even when it was easy, he had made up his mind. Even when he didn't know the cost, didn't know the circumstances, he had already predetermined, pre-decided in his heart, he had purposed in his heart, he would not defile himself. So what does he do? And I think there's something about Daniel. It wasn't just about conviction that he had, but what we see in his life was character. Because it wasn't just deep-rooted conviction, we also see a deep-rooted respect for people around him. In a sense, you could say, when we look at Jesus, we recognize him as full of grace and truth. What we see in Daniel's life, even right here, he held the truth very strongly, and yet there was a grace here in his heart, in his life, for others. As I mentioned, verse 8, but Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore, he requested of the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. But notice in verse 9, he does not demand, he doesn't just rebel, but he goes to the person who is in charge, who can do something. What we see here in verse 9, he doesn't go to social media and just plaster to the world, look how bad I am being treated. Look how the circumstances that I am put and the choices that I have to make. He didn't plaster it out to everybody. It says in verse 9, now God brought Daniel into the favor and goodwill of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my Lord the king. Well, yeah, you probably would fear the Lord. Fear Nebuchadnezzar. Because later on it mentions, but he says, who has appointed your food and drink? For why should he see your faces looking worse than the young men who are your age? Then you would endanger my head before the king. So here he says, I fear the king. And the way you look and the way you are endangers me and my head with the king. Basically, in a sense, what he's saying is, hey, if you don't look the greatest, it's not your head on the stake. It's my head on the stake. So what does Daniel do with that? In verse 14, it says, so he consented with them in this matter and tested them or yes, tested them 10 days. And at the end of the 10 days, their features appeared better and fatter in flesh than all the young men who ate the portion of the king's men. So as we think about this passage, Daniel, or we'll go back, actually, I think I skipped a passage, verse 11. So Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days, and let them give us vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance be examined before you, and the appearance of the young men who eat the portion of the king's delicacies, and as you see fit, so deal with your servants. So what does Daniel do? He doesn't just protest. He says, hey, I recognize the situation you're in. And I recognize at the end of the 3 years, we're going to be graded. Could you give us 10 days? Can you just give us a trial period? And at the end of the trial period, now what we see here, Daniel is not saying at the end of that trial period, we'll go ahead and eat the king's meat if you don't like the outcome. He doesn't give that as an alternative. What he says basically is, at the end of that 10 days, I'm still not going to eat it, but I am giving you liberty to do with whatever you want to us. You can kill us, you can slave us, we are at your bidding. There isn't an arrogance about him. You see, he's dogmatic in what he believed, but you could also say he was diplomatic in how he behaved. And the reality was, in the end of the story, the king and this man, it wasn't necessarily about the king's food that was important to them. It was all about how he looked and how he performed. And Daniel says, you know what? You feed us these vegetables, you feed us water, you can do with it whatever you want. And that's where in verse 14, so he consented with them in this matter and tested them 10 days. And at the end of the 10 days, their features appeared better and fatter in flesh than all the young men who ate the portion of the king's delicacies. Thus the steward took away their portion of delicacies and the wine that they were to drink and gave them vegetables. As for these 4 young men, God gave them knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Now at the end of the days, when the king had said that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. Then the king interviewed them, and among them all, none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they served before the king. And in all matters of wisdom and understanding about which the king examined them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers who were in all his realm. Thus Daniel continued until the 1st year of King Cyrus. Now the reality, when Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself, he did not know the outcome. He didn't know if he would be taken from the king's courts and put as a slave. He didn't know if it'd be even worse, that he would just be executed. He did not know the outcome, but that didn't matter to him. It wasn't about the outcome, it was about who he would remain loyal to. He would not defile himself. He had purposed in his heart. Now, none of us, most likely, will not be taken to a foreign land. We'll be placed with decisions like this. But yet all of us, sometimes every single day of our life, are faced with decisions of who we will be more loyal to. To God or the people around us, the circumstances around us, our friends, our family, our boss, whatever it might be. And rather than saying, well, who's more merciful? Everybody else is doing it, and God's not judging them. The real question comes down, why do we serve and why do we do what we do? Do we do it out of fear? Wondering what's going to happen? Do we serve God out of fear? Is he going to do something against me if I don't do this? Do we do it out of fear what other people will do to us? That was not how David lived his life, or Daniel. Daniel made his choice not about who he feared the most or who would show the most mercy. He made the decision based on who was the most deserving, who was the greatest. And he recognized his body, his being, was God's. Although Nebuchadnezzar could take him, change his culture, change his clothing, change his name, change his language. Even the book of Daniel is one of the few books that was not written in Hebrew. It was written in Aramaic. Even though all of those things could change on the outside, Daniel recognized, my being is still God's. And you can't own that. And the question is, when we face certain things, some things, it may seem so little, but yet as Jesus mentioned, he that is faithful in the little things is faithful in much. And if Daniel would not have made this decision and purposed in his heart when he was young, we would never read about Daniel in the lion's den. But what we see is Daniel, as he purposed in his heart, God blessed him. God is the one that gave him the wisdom. God is the one that lifted him up and elevated him. And it mentions at the end of that chapter, Daniel continued until the first year of King Cyrus. Now, doesn't mean much to us in one degree, but when you calculate it, that's about 70 years later. 70 years that Daniel continued in this serving not just one king, but the next king, and the next king, and the next king. One country to the next country to the next country. And God continued to elevate him. Why? He purposed on his heart. He had conviction that he was not going to change. But yet, with that conviction, he had character. How he treated people in the midst of the circumstances. But as we think about our life, again, we're not going to face situations like that. But we have to come back and ask ourselves, what do we do when we know what we ought to do, but it might cost us? What do we do when we know God wants us to do certain things, but we're tired? Well, the biggest thing is pre-deciding. And that can go with our time. When we come and fellowship, when we worship God together on a Sunday. If we wait until Sunday morning to decide whether we go or not, there's a good chance we won't go. But if we pre-decide, and actually I was talking to Anna last night even, like the impact that the night before, and when you go through Hebrew scriptures, it is the night and the day, the evening and the morning were the first day. The day of the Hebrew life started at 6 p.m. the night before. And I think there is a lot of truth and a lot of emphasis that we ought to think about that. Because how we finish our evening has a massive impact on the next day. If we don't get enough sleep in the evening, it ruins our day, the following day, right? And so if we get to bed at a proper time the night before, it makes the day so much better. And I think there is a lot of emphasis how you finish one day. 6 o'clock, I believe, really has a massive impact. How you finish that evening has an impact on the following day, which I think is part of the reason why God did say evening and morning. But also our relationships. Our relationships that we have. How does that impact me and my loyalty to God? My finances. How I use my finances. If we wait until, well, all the bills are paid before we give our tithe to the Lord, most likely we're not going to wait. We're not going to tithe. And that's where even that testing, that proving God, it starts at the first fruits, the very first income, and giving back to the Lord, because it is a testing, it is a proving. This money, I don't deserve it. It belongs to God. He allows me to keep the 90%, and I'm just giving back the 10%. But if we wait until we make sure everything else is covered, most likely we won't do it. We won't give. And these are the things, so many different things in our life. We have to ask, what does God desire of me? And will I pre-decide? Because if I don't pre-decide, the decision is already made. And so as we think about Daniel's life, in the first chapter, this was one of the most important decisions that he ever made. And as a sentence or a phrase that I heard, every decision that we make is a vote for our future. Think about that. This decision that he made was a vote for his future. The decisions that we make today, the decisions that we make tomorrow, throughout this week, is a stepping stone. It is a block for our entire future. That's a big thought. Now, the reality is, I can't change what I've already decided. I can't change the past. I can't change all of the choices that have gone before me. But we do have the power today, as we go forward, committing ourselves to God, recognizing He is deserving of all praise. He is the one worthy of me to surrender all to Him.